So it's good to be back over here in a certain sense. So to be back in this world of online communication is probably something that means something very different from what we meant 2 years ago. But it's good to be again, at least virtually seeing faces and talking about. We are still able to cross boundaries in that sense. What I plan to do today is give a kind of a presentation using speculative fiction just as a case study in India, but also to kind of show how literature and interdisciplinarity are not something new, but is something that we probably need to kind of look towards or look forward to, which has happened over the last 30, 40 years. And I'm going to use speculative fiction as a sort of as an example of how certain boundaries can be crossed. Now, as a part of that, I'll just share my presentation in case. Since I'm on my phone, I think it would be better if I switch off my video and I start the presentation, but we'll see as we go along. I hope you can see the presentation. Johnson, I think, is it visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay. This is visible. I can't switch off my video, so let's see how it goes. If there is a drop in the audio quality, do let me know. Then I'll switch off. So what I plan to do is look at how interdisciplinarity works in certain kinds of cases, and this is something that has not been really. So literature departments have always been seen as those places which crosses boundaries, which looks at interdisciplinary functionalities, which is one of those departments which kind of moves towards a certain kind of other kind of structuralities, other kinds of premises that many other departments are not very open to. So in a sense, we are fortunate enough to be kind of in literature departments in a certain sense. And when I say literature departments, I mean English literature departments, but I'm sure that this also happens across other European forms of literature departments. So crossing these boundaries, of course, would mean that we just do not move into literary theoretical studies, but also are kind of impulses and principles that are developed since quite a long time in other fields as well. So what I do is I'll try to look at some of these other developments that are operating in different ways in the case of speculative fiction in particular, but also in terms of what we call in terms of genre formation. Speculative fiction is a particular kind of a genre, and I'm going to look into that particular kind of genre. But think in terms of what we call minor genres and major genre. How do we distinguish between minor genre and major genre, etc., etc.? And that's what I'm going to problematize and then see how speculative fiction can open up those boundaries of what is minor, what is major, etc. Now, if we move into major genres that have been studied in India over a period of time in departments of literature, is the genre of the novel. And if you look at the history of writing in English or in the literature, general in the literature and translation or in the literary histories, focus on is the prosaic form of the novel. So when we start a history of anything, and this is always seen as one of the major genres that developed around the 19th century. Now, before I move on to what I intend to do with this major genre, and how speculative fiction kind of counterposes a different kind of an aesthetic to the major genre. Uh, my examples are going to mostly come from 19th century, early 20th century, but I am also going to mostly give examples from Bengali literature, because that's the kind of literature that I'm a bit aware of. But I'm sure that I can think of other examples from other regional literatures that are available, and see whether what I'm proposing also applies to those kind of literatures. So coming back to the major genre in Indian literary studies, in English literary studies, uh, what tends to be posited, what tends to be foregrounded constantly, is this idea of the novel form. And well, I'm not going to look into poetry or non-fictional prose, etc. But what seems to kind of hinge the entire theory of generic forms in Indian literary history, or Indian writing in that sense, seems to be the novel form. And we all know the story of Indulekha and, for example, one of the earliest novels in Marathi called Yamuna Paryatan, and one of the earliest novels in Bangla called Anand, and how this novel itself traveled across boundaries, how this novel itself traveled across languages, translated across languages, and became kind of benchmarks for writing the novel form, which was seen as benchmarks of creating a certain kind of a as well as realistic over in that sense. So the regional gets formed through novels like Indulekha, Anand Math, Yamuna Paryatan, etc. And we know that all these novels were primarily, in a sense, of creating both a regional form, but also aspired to a certain kind of a national aesthetic. And therefore, the novel form is seen as this primary locus of the nationalistic formation of the genre. And because it was produced within this larger imagination or imaginary of the nation, the novel is always seen as an important part of critical literary studies. And you would hardly find any history book, and it's of course important during that age. And we tend to continue with the novel form even in the early 20th century, even the post-independence period. So even if you look at Indian writing in English today, what seems to be exalted, glorified, when we trace the current history of Indian writing in English, we always go back to novels like whatever, Rushdie or the post-Rushdie moment, etc. The novel becomes one of the most frivolous forms. And that's what's happening in the 19th century, and how historiography happens around the 19th century around the novel. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so your audio is breaking off in between. Could you try
Okay, all right.
you?
What I'll do is I'll try to switch off the video then.
Yes, so if you could
I'll
turn off your
stop
video and
sharing. Is the audio better now, Dr. Johnson?
yes, sir, it's better.
Yeah, yeah. And can you see the screen?
Yes, so we can see your presentation. Yes.
Oh, okay, great. Uh, so if it breaks off again, do let me know. I'm trying to adjust my
Yeah,
this this is what the major genre, this means genre, how it was constructed through studies as a part of the historiography of Indian writing in English and in the literature in that sense. But of course, what we now know is that there were other kinds of genres at that point of time, and I'll just quickly go through them to indicate the other possibilities that have been explored now recently, but also where that kind of a counter narrative or sometimes supplementary narratives to the major genre of the novel. So the major genre of the novel, of course, was one of those things that traveled across boundaries, that was part of the critical literary studies. But you also have these other forms that emerged during this period of 19th, early 20th century, different kinds of imagining more that existence, mostly by women at that point of time. And as you can see from these three these images on the slide, so you had imaginings of a kind of a region, of a different kind of a performance practice in writings by testimony autobiography by the famous actress who used to work in 19th century theatre with one of the most famous theatre practitioners of Bengal called Girish Ghosh, who also in his plays, of course, produced a certain kind of a nationalistic imagination about India. So, which was primarily an imagination of a certain kind of a glorious past, which has been destroyed subsequently, etc. But Dasi's own imagining in her autobiography of this great past, or of her own tutelage under Girish Ghosh, is extremely problematic, and she problematizes this entire imagining that Girish Ghosh poses in his theatre. Similarly, for example, you have Sharala Devi's diary, where she reminisces about her own stay and her own kind of a passage through the famous Tagore household, where you have this great nationalist imagining poet Rabindranath Tagore writing about the nation, and Sharala Devi constantly undercutting this through this notion of the Brahmos, which was a specific kind of a sect which moved away from the Hindu practices. And this entire tension within the Tagore family itself between the Brahmos and the Hindus, etc. So you have a different kind of an imagining being posited through these testimony and memoir. And of course, you have the most famous Ras Sundari Devi's My Life. In Bengali, it's called Amar Jibon, which imagines life. Remember, she was the mother of one of the most famous leaders of the Brahmo Samaj in Bengal. And Rasundari Devi, of course, imagines her own domesticated forms of struggle with not only, and she's writing this when she's almost 75. So her own recapturing of this, of not only of her own self, but also the progress that, the process of becoming a woman, is something that again reimagines or reconfigures or reconceptualizes this larger imagination of the major generic form of the novel, where a certain kind of a nation is getting projected or produced, etc. And I'm sure that there are hundreds of examples from other regional forms, and I'm sure that you know all about them. Similarly, you have a different kind of an imagining, for example, in travelogues, where, again, around the 19th, 20th century, the first image that you see is Dir Muhammad, who, of course, traveled in the 18th century, not in the 19th century, and his own recollection of his stay, well, travel to England, his stay in England, etc. He was one of those first persons who opened a tea house, a Hindustani tea house in England in the 18th century, and became quite prosperous, actually. Stayed back in England, married a white woman, etc. So that this entire notion of travel as imagination, of a different kind of an imagination, which is not really bounded by a national imaginary, but a different kind of an imaginary, where you move away from the national to a different kind of look, so the outsider gaze onto the colonial gaze, etc. So the colonial gaze is not really, so it's not simply the British looking at you, but you are looking back at the British, etc. Similarly, you have other forms like Bengali Lady in England by Krishna Bhavini Das, who was one of the earliest women to travel to England to study and explore things over there. And she again looks back at the culture of England in a different way. So it's not simply the people over there who are constructing the Indian in a certain form, but you are also the Indians constructing the West in a certain form. And these travelogues are very interesting categories in that sense. So you have a different imagining of the nation looking back at the metropole. So you have the oppressed in that sense, looking back at the oppressor, or if you don't want these kind of simple categories, so you have the reverse gaze in that sense. So it's not simply the British colonial formations that are constructing you; you are reconstructing them. You're kind of reconfiguring them in a certain sense. And of course, there are other examples. The last one is a pretty interesting one because this doesn't travel to the West. The last one, the last image on the right that you see is by someone called Horiprabha Takeda, who actually traveled to Japan in 1920s with a husband. Well, she had a Japanese husband who used to work with an East India Company. And she fell in love with him. And the husband went back during the First World War. And she found it extremely difficult to go there. Finally, she managed to meet her husband and be in Japan for a long time. And she wrote this entire travelogue of Japan. So you have a different kind of Asian imagination in these kind of travelogues. So it's not simply about the West, but also about travelogues imagining a different kind of a nation altogether, like Japan. Okay, so let's leave it at that. So what I'm trying to say over here is that it's not simply through the major genres that you can imagine a trajectory of literature. Literature can travel across boundaries, and these boundaries can be crossed not only through crossing disciplines, but also crossing certain kinds of generic boundaries. So the boundaries of the genre also produces this kind of an interdisciplinarity in that sense. So let's come to speculative fiction and what I mean by how do you look at speculative fiction. Now, when you look at speculative fiction, I'm going to talk about all these three images that you see, Kailash Chandra Dutt and Rokaya and Shoshi Chandra Dutt, a bit later. But when I say speculative fiction, then it becomes extremely problematic. What do I mean by speculative fiction at all? So I think it's good to start with a kind of a definition of speculative fiction. Now, Marek Osowitz, for example, says that it includes all sorts of fantasy, science fiction, horror, etc. And you can also have hybrids. You can have dystopia, utopia, gothic, weird fiction, and of course, later in the 1960s and 70s, forms like alternate history, steampunk, slipstream, etc. So speculative fiction is a large umbrella term that is used for huge different kinds of fiction, like science fiction, etc., which were for a very long time seen as separate categories, but now people tend to look at it as speculative fiction, where the speculative fiction can be used as an umbrella term to include all these categories. So you can have horror, for example, you can have science fiction, for example, you can have magic realism, fractured fairy tales, etc. So you can have different sorts of things within the notion of the speculative. Now, what Auschwitz also goes on to say in her book was that this speculative also has this potential for challenging consensus reality. So while the novel, at least in the 19th century or the 20th century, early 20th century, is I'm going to use an extremely problematic term, but let me use it. Is seen mostly as mimetic, as something that produces a certain kind of a social realism. So the novel kind of reflects what is happening outside. Well, how it reflects it and what is the politics of the reflection is something that we can talk about later. But it's generally seen as mimetic. It's generally seen, at least in the earliest developments of the novel form, as something that kind of reflects a sort of a social reality. So you kind of have social realist novels. Now, what the speculative fiction does, Osiris argues, is that uh, uh, it kind of challenges this idea of the consensus, this idea of accepted reality. And David Atterbury, for example, goes on to say that it is a disruption of the mimetic representation, etc. Now, people like Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, who has worked extensively on Indian speculative fiction, tends to call them genre fiction. He says that they can better be seen as genre fiction rather than have a separate category like speculative fiction, because they were mostly a part of pulp literature or popular literature or pop fiction, and they were never part of the mainstream literary productions. So if you look at the history of Bengali literature, or if you even look at the history of English literature, for that matter, in India, uh, you will hardly find any speculative texts in them because they were seen mostly as extremely popular pulp, etc. And therefore, Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay says that they might be considered as genre fiction rather than no speculative fiction, etc. But I'll stick to the term speculative, and we can have kind of a discussion on what is the distinction between genre and speculative, etc. Let's move on to how do we go about it. So how do we speculative fiction? Now, one of the problems that we face when we look at speculative fiction and we try to explore speculative fiction in India is, and this is where we come to the problem of disciplines. Now, if you look into histories, even histories of regional literatures like Bengali literature, Odia literature, or Malayalam literature, you will hardly find any mention of these kind of fictions that were written at that point of time, because I said that they were seen as part of a non-elite street culture. So they were popular, they were pulp. In Bengal, they were called, for example, the Bottola books. Interestingly, the term Bottola means books that were sold under the tree. So they were not sold in bookstores. So the Bottola is, bot is a tree, basically a banyan tree. So books that were sold under the banyan tree, and it's only very weird characters who used to buy these books because these were full of pornography or full of crime and things that is not part of the elite culture. So books that were sold in bookstores were the books that were supposed to be studied. So most of the speculative fiction that I'm going to talk about was primarily produced in very little known magazines, little known publishing houses, though they were written by quite well known people. So it's not that they were not written by, they were not written by anyone. They were written by pretty well known authors in Bengali literature. But if you look at the history of them, it's not there. So these books are not mentioned at all because they're not seen as a part of the mainstream production. So what do you do then? So where do you find material on this? And so one of the problems of researching this or crossing the disciplinary boundaries is the discipline is already kind of bounded by this notion of what is known as literature, or how is literature produced, etc. So how do you cross those disciplines? Now, not again much secondary material is available on the speculative fiction. So how do we go about it? So I'll try to quickly kind of outline what I mean by crossing the disciplines, because there are other disciplines which has looked into this, not really speculative fiction, but they have looked into other forms of emergences, like the popular culture, which tends to be ignored, at least for a good measure in departments of English. Now, one of them, for example, is if you look at the history of expansion of the British Empire. So when the British Empire first came in, of course, by 1765, you know that Bengal was handed over by Shah Alam to Clive, especially after 1757, after the Battle of Plassey. What you have is this handing over the Diwani of Bengal, which basically meant that the British could collect taxes in Bengal. Of course, in those days, Bengal also included Bihar and parts of Assam, etc., and Odisha. So what you have is this major historical event, but also this major historical event produces this immense desire to map the territory. So you have this immense amount of maps that are created, especially after 1765, after the handing over of the Diwani. You have these massive amounts of maps getting created all over the place. One of the most famous people who does this is a cartographer called James Rennell. And Rennell's maps become one of the most popular maps. Interestingly, Rennell, what he does is he actually maps, for example, the Gangetic Delta. So, for example, he maps the movement of the river Ganges when it enters Bengal or when it branches off, the Brahmaputra branches off into Assam, etc. But he calls them maps of Hindustan. He doesn't call them maps of Bengal. So there is already an imagination of an expansionist project. These maps were used primarily for purposes of expansion of the British Empire. We know that by 1820s, for example, 1799, of course, is the fall of Tipu, and by 1820s, you already have the fall of the Marathas. And 1857, of course, is the fall of the entire structure of the Mughal Empire. So what you have is these maps and territories. Maps also locate territories, and these maps produce a certain kind of an imagination, a colonial imagination, which is seen as primarily of a certain kind of a truth value. So once you can map a territory, then you can start stating certain facts about it, or you can start defining the area in a certain way. You can start saying things about the area that might have been extremely messy, because now if you have a map which is extremely measured, which is extremely well organized, where you know how the territory operates, etc., then the territory can be defined in a certain way, and you can start defining the territory in your own terms. The same thing happens with architecture. For example, the development of the city of Calcutta, just to give you an example, happens in a very interesting way. Now, if you are familiar with the geography of Calcutta during the colonial period, these were simply islands. So what the British did was they joined three small villages together and formed the city of Calcutta. But when they laid out the colonial capital by 1830s and 1840s, you already have a different kind of an imagination at work. So you have, for example, an axis of merchandise. So in one area of Calcutta still exists. So if you ever visit Calcutta, do visit these areas. So you have this axis of merchandise. So you have the stock exchange, you have the treasury, you have the mint, etc. So all these are produced within one quadrant of the city. Then you have the axis of power. So you have the government house, which is now, of course, the governor's house, as it is called. So you have the government house where the governor general is supposed to stay. You have the writers' building, as it is called. This is where the government operates, etc. So that is another quadrant. And the third quadrant is an axis of, so you have the axis of governance, but you also have the axis of power. So you have the Fort William, you have the military barracks, etc. So the city is shaped. So it's not simply the city, kind of the messy villageness of the city exists. Once the colonial power comes in, the city is shaped in a certain way. And this produces a different kind of an imagination of the city, not only in terms of what it does to the city, but also in terms of who lives in the city, who has access to the city, who are the people who can come and get educated in the city, etc., etc. And that also kind of influences the kind of literary production that is valorized, the kind of literary production that becomes important over a period of time, etc. What are the kind of newspapers that are getting printed? Who owns these newspapers? Where is the printing technology coming from, etc. So you have different sorts of variety questions once you move into this territory. And there is not quite a lot of work, but a bit of work into this territory. And these disciplinary boundaries that, which is not literary, of course, so these studies are in political geography, etc. But they give us very interesting insights of what sort of imaginations of the city can happen, or what sort of imaginations of a colonial empire or the colonial metropole can happen, etc. And then, of course, we can come back to literary forms and see how they're responding to it. So this is one way of looking at it. The second, of course, is that one of the things that the colonial empire did was bring in a huge amount of science and technology. The logic, again, I'm trying to put it very simply, is that because the colonial power has express access to science and technology, therefore, they are superior, they are a superior civilization, they're a superior race, etc. Indians, since they don't have access to science and technology, etc., they're inferior and they have to be taught about. And there is a whole series of things that happen because of this. Interestingly, in 1857, during the Great Rebellion, you have one of the reasons that many of the Indian forces are defeated is because English have access to the telegraph, because they can communicate much faster than the Indian forces can. So you have, for example, the introduction of railways by 1848, and you have the introduction of the telegraph by 1849, you have the post office. So technology, so science and technology becomes an important aspect of creating a different kind of an imagination of what the colonial rulers are bringing in. And this imagination, of course, takes us into a different direction altogether. Because if you look at literature produced during the 19th century, there seems to be an obsession almost in almost all Indian writers with this new nature of science or the new nature of technology. And not only in Indian writers, but also in Western writers. So if you look at people like Kipling, there is an obsession almost with this nature of science and technology that is reshaping the colonial area. So how do you so is it a good idea to kind of move into these directions and see what kind of studies have happened? And fortunately, there have been quite a few studies in science and technology studies, for example, in 19th century, where people have traced this history of science and technology, what it did to the imagining of India, what it did to the imagining of the nationalistic imagination, etc. So probably we can draw from that as well. Probably. The third, of course, is this entire notion of education. And I'm sure that as English students or English colleagues, you would be aware of the establishment of the universities of Calcutta, Bombay, Madras in 1857. By 1882, of course, you have the universities of Punjab and Allahabad. But of course, we always tend, as English students, we tend to go back to 1835 to Macaulay's Minute. Interestingly, Macaulay's Minute did not have much of an influence, though we keep on talking about it ad infinitum. It was an important official policy, but by 1882, we know the Hunter Commission, there is a commission that is set up specifically because Macaulay's Minute has been an abject failure. So English has not been able to percolate across regions, across territories, and the Hunter Commission is set up primarily to see what the problem is. I mean, why is English not getting percolate? There is a lot of resistance from the ground, etc. And this is, just to give you an example, for example, you have, this is often resisted by British officers. So Lieutenant Colonel in Bhopal, for example, insists that he's not going to teach English in the schools over there, primarily because he thinks that it is only through indigenous languages, through vernaculars, through regional languages, that education should be given. Similar thing happens with in the United Punjab province. Someone called James Thomason, for example, refuses to teach English. He says English is not important. We need to teach in the local languages and whatever languages are available, etc. So it's not that Macaulay's Minute is the end all of everything. So when we look at educational this thing, so when we kind of are fixated on Macaulay or fixated on the establishment of the universities, it's not that English becomes a major force. There is quite a lot of resistance on the ground, and it's important to go back to that resistance. For example, textbooks is a major place of resistance. So much so, and I'm sure that many of you will know that the 1897 Sedition Act, which still exists, is brought out primarily because of the problem of the textbook. Because when the British government finds out in Maharashtra that a textbook is propagating against British rule and which is supported by Tilak, and he actually writes about it in his publication called Kesari, about the textbook. And when the British government also finds out that this textbook was actually written by a British official, or an Indian official employed by the British, they're even more furious. So they come up with the Sedition Act, and the first person who is tried under the Sedition Act is Tilak. So textbooks play an important role in this education of how the colonial imagination is countered, what sort of education should be given, etc., etc. So this is another branch of another disciplinary branch that we can move into. And again, some studies have happened in this field about how textbooks produced a different kind of a counter imagination to the colonial imagination. And the fourth thing that we can move into is, of course, institutional histories. For example, the picture that you see over here is that of Asiatic Society, which was formed in 1784 in Calcutta. And of course, you had Asiatic Society in Bombay later, etc. And the Asiatic Society is an interesting institution itself, because we all know about it from terms of William Jones and the great Sanskritist. Interestingly, Jones was extremely frustrated with his learning of Sanskrit. He actually wrote in his personal letters that he believes that the Brahmin priests who are teaching him Sanskrit are giving him completely false ideas about texts. And he's not very sure whether whatever they are telling him is true or whether they are false. So I'm sorry about the sound. Just give me a minute. Yeah, sorry about that. So Asiatic Society produces a certain kind of a different kind of institutional locus, which can be called appropriative. So one of the things that Asiatic Society, for example, does is appropriate knowledge. So it is involved in a lot of translations. It takes up a large number of texts and actually canonizes a large number of texts which were not considered to be very canonized in India for a very long time. So through translations, the institution itself becomes appropriative. Interestingly, I was talking about textbooks. Asiatic Society also produces textbooks, in mostly science textbooks, which is used in schools, etc. So this is another form of book history and institutional histories that you can move into, moving in the directions to understand how 19th century operated at that point of time. Now, what has this to do with speculative fiction? So I'll come to that very quickly. But before that, of course, what I have shown you till now is mostly colonial. So it's mostly colonial archive, it's mostly 19th century, etc. Now, there is also a lot of responses from the Bengali intelligentsia, at least in the 19th century, to these colonial enterprises. Very quickly, on the first picture that you see on the left top is of someone called Radhakanta Dev Bahadur, who actually is a board member of the Calcutta Book Society, the society that I talked about, which produces textbooks. But he produces a kind of a response, and he's not the only one. There are quite a few that believe that there is no point in having Western education. There is always a golden past that you can go back to, and all answers are contained in that golden past. So that is one kind of a response that you see, at least in Bengal, and I'm sure in other regions as well. So you have a very strong undercurrent of going back to the past, retrieving that past, and forget everything historically that has happened in between, and then kind of reinstate that past to counter the present. So the British colonialism does not bring anything new because all knowledge is available in the glorious past of India. Now, interestingly, this argument is also based on the British construction of the Indian past. So, if you look at British histories at this point of time, in 1820s and 1830s, especially people like Alexander Dow's History of Hindustan, uh, he does specifically this. He actually constructs a glorious past and then completely says that the British dominion is absolutely important because Indians have forgotten that glorious past, and our job is to make them remember that glorious past, etc. So you have this kind of a response, which is kind of mimicking the colonial response. The other picture that you see on the extreme left, on the bottom of the screen, is a Kalighat painting, of course, that many of you can make out. A Kalighat painting is basically a specific kind of painting that develops in Bengal in 19th century, which actually responds to real social issues. So it's not really painting of kings and queens, etc. It's about the social life that is being led, and that is what Kalighat paintings do. And one of the things, of course, is the problem of you know the question of access for women, and this is a major debate that happens. So you have a different kind of a women's response to this, and the debates are extremely long, so I'm not going to go into that. But this is another form of response that operates at this level. So not only in terms of literature, it's not only literary response of women, but also the kind of dress that a woman should wear, the kind of um, speech that a woman should have, the kind of language that the woman should be taught, the kind of knowledge that the woman should have access to, the kind of textbooks for women, and there are many textbooks for women during this period. So you have a different kind of a discourse operating over there. And third picture in the middle that you see is of, I'm sure many of you will recognize him, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. And Syed Ahmad Khan, of course, after 1857, well, not Syed Ahmad Khan, but after 1857, there are a lot of government reports that shows that the Muslim community is completely marginalized after 1857 because Muslims are seen as the villain after 1857. Primarily because Bahadur Shah Zafar was seen as the titular head of the rebellion. And so while a large amount of the Hindu intellectuals get access to colonial jobs, the Muslims are almost banned from colonial jobs for a very long time. And this leads to different sorts of movements within Muslim organizations, especially around the north of India, but also in the south of India. And one of the things that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, for example, does is give a community response. So the community has to respond to it in a certain way. And interestingly, what he says is it is only through colonial education that the community can respond to it. So, I mean, again, I'm putting it very simplistically because Sir Syed Ahmad Khan is a complex figure. But this is another way of responding to the colonial regime, etc. So we probably also need to look at these responses in a certain way. So the first one, Radhakanta Dev Bahadur, rejection of the past, go back, rejection of the present, go back to the past. The second one, the patriarchal system doesn't work, so women's response to that. And the third one is a more community-based responses. And there are many other kinds of responses, but these are some responses that we probably need to pay attention to understand what is happening. But there is also a fifth element, and that is where speculative fiction comes in. Now, what we see is that when all these forms of knowledge enter the 19th century, early 20th century, there is also a sort of a possibility of negotiation. So you can say that, the epistemological systems or the knowledge systems that you have brought in is okay, we will kind of grudgingly accept it, but we also will negotiate it through our own selves, we'll negotiate it through our own understandings of it, we'll negotiate it through our own location or interrelationalities or intersectionalities. So what we can do is we can so many of the Indians are responding to it in completely different ways, as you can see in the novel form. So if you look at the 19th century novel, early 20th century novel, then there is a different kind of a location that is produced, that is getting cited, which sometimes is accepting of the larger rationalist enlightenment principle of the British colonial system, but it also is kind of negotiating it through a certain kind of a location of the self, etc. And just to give you an example, Mahendra Lal Sarkar, whom I've quoted over here on this slide, formed something called the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science. And Sarkar, of course, says that in a very bombastic way that we are not going to be, we do not submit to a foreign yoke, we have inherited mind not inferior, etc., etc. But he's actually a scientist, he's a doctor. He's one of the earliest medical doctors from the Calcutta Medical College. So he's already accepted the medical science that has come in. But at the same time, he's kind of resisting it in a certain way. In fact, Sarkar has a very interesting history, and I won't go into that, but during the Q&A, if you have questions on that, we will discuss this. So you have these kind of responses as well, which is very ambivalent, very ambiguous in a certain form. So it's not simply nativism. It's not what Radhakanta Dev Bahadur was doing, that let's go back to the past, forget the present. No, it's like, okay, let's engage with the present, but let's engage with the present in a different way, etc. So it produces a space of negotiation. So I'll give you an example of, so after all this, let me just quickly then go through what I mean by the speculative space and how literature and interdisciplinarity can help to understand the speculative space. And I'll give you a possible classification. Now, it's extremely difficult to classify speculative fiction because remember, the first example that I'm going to give is from 1835. Now, what we call speculative fiction in the West can be traced back to, let's say, 1818 by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And you really can't go back beyond that. But Frankenstein, even if you take 1818 as one of the earliest texts of speculative fiction in the West, 1835 is very, very interesting because even before what we call, well, true speculative fiction, though I don't know whether there is such a term called true speculative fiction, but if there is something like what we consider to be the canon of speculative fiction in the West, it generally begins around 1870s and 1880s. So you have H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and others who produce this kind of a science fiction text. And so you have 1835 where it begins in a certain form. So if we try to classify speculative fiction, I'll just give you examples and then stop. You can have speculative fiction which can be called anti-colonial futures. Now, the two images that you see on the slide over here is one was written in 1835, the image on the right, and this was written by Kailash Chandra Dutt. The book was called A Journal of 48 Hours of the year 1945. Now, as you can see, it is written in 1835, but it speculates about a possible history in 1945, which is almost prescient because 1947 is the year of independence. So he almost kind of gets it right. And the text is about an English-educated Bengali gentleman who decides to fight the British. And it is simply about a fight that happens between the two armies. In the first battle, the Bengali gentleman defeats the British army. In the second battle, he is captured and killed, etc. That's the text. That's basically the narrative. But you have very interesting futuristic predictions of what is happening in terms of the speculation of a different kind of an imagination. Now remember, the novel is still not doing it in 1835. In fact, you hardly have the novel form at this point of time. So you have a fictional form that is already producing an imagination which is not really a national imagination, because the text is not about India. It is about the freedom of the city of Calcutta. Remember, it is 1835. So the larger imagination of the nation is still not present. But you have this possibility of imagining a space where the British can be a certain kind of a speculative defeat can be laid on the British. And that is where it begins in a certain form. The second image that you see is was produced in 1845 and was written by Shoshi Chandra Dutt. Both of them are in English. Now, Shoshi was Kailash's cousin. And the text that he wrote was called The Republic of Orissa, a page from the annals of the 20th century. Now, this again is about a region which is almost like Bengal. So it is the story is about a certain kind of, very interestingly, about a tribal rebellion that happens in Orissa against the British, where the British are completely defeated, and that leads to the formation of the Republic of Orissa, which is independent from the British. So again, a different kind of an imagination, which again is not contained in 1830s and 40s. So the speculative space allows you to produce a different sort of an imaginary possibility. Now, that is possible primarily because you can transcend the generic discipline of what we call a novel or what we call prose fiction or whatever, etc. And so that's my argument. That's what I'm saying, that the speculative space allows you to cross not only the possibility of what can be possible in terms of nation or region or whatever, but also in terms of the generic boundaries that is imposed upon a novel or upon a prose or upon a poetic form, etc. So that generic boundary can be transcended in a certain sense. Now, these are all in English. The other examples that I'm going to give you are from Bengali, but they have been translated into English. The second possibility that occurs, and this is around 1875, well, not around, it's in 1875, you have alternative histories. Now, the text is by someone called Bhudev Mukherjee. Bhudev Mukherjee wrote this text called The History of India Revealed in a Dream. And the text has been translated by Shurdeep Mukherjee. And it is an interesting text because what it does is it doesn't go back to the ancient past at all. It talks about the immediate past. Now, if you know about the history of that period, Ahmad Shah Abdali, for example, defeats the Marathas in 1765. Well, not 1765, earlier than that. And almost takes over the Mughal Empire. So the Marathas are defeated, they go back, etc. And the text takes on from there. So it's not about the ancient whatever past. It's about the contemporary, almost a contemporary past, 100 years back. And what you do is you reorganize that to create a different kind of history. And the history, of course, takes on colonial regime, it takes on Indian economic system, etc., etc. But it's a completely rewritten history of India. Now, remember, in 1875, you already have a lot of colonial histories of India. But what Bhudev does in the text, Bhudev Mukherjee does in the text, is produce a different kind of an imagination of history. Now, we can always problematize this history because it is a very strongly Hindu-based history. It is well, sometimes it is extremely syncretic, but it seems to be going back to this possibility of if you can change history, what would have happened, etc. But we can talk about that as a text, but the very possibility of an alternative history is something that is already available by 1875. Now, remember, alternative histories are an important aspect of speculative fiction, and if you look at modern speculative fiction, especially after the 20th century, many of them are alternative histories. So, you have feminist histories, for example, through speculative spaces, etc. The third possibility, of course, is science stories, and these are very interesting stories. And I'll just give you two examples. One story is by Himlal Datta, and that is written in 1882, again available in English. The story is called The Mystery, or in Bengali it's called Rahosyo. And it was published in a very well-known science magazine called Vigyan Darpan. And the story is about a man who visits England, one of his scientist friends in England, and looks at these wonderful inventions that he has done in the house. But there is a problem, and it's a very interesting story to look at, because the problem is that he has a device which is basically a telephone. So he picks up the device thinking that he's talking to his friend's wife, his British friend's wife, but turns out that it's actually the maid, and the maid takes offense, thinking that this person is kind of making sexual advances towards her, and this leads to a lot of problems. And of course, this is solved through science. So this precarity of the colonized position within a colonial space of these wonders of science through sexual whatever predatorship, or an assumed sexual predatorship, is again something that interestingly comes out in these stories, a theme that is hardly tackled in many of the other speculative fiction that you see later in India or abroad. The second story that I'm going to talk about is, well, briefly mention, is The Runaway Storm, and this is written by none other than Jagdish Chandra Bose, the great man who was a very well-known scientist. Of course, you are aware of him. And The Runaway Storm is basically a series of reports about a storm that is supposed to hit Calcutta and doesn't hit it. And everyone is speculating about why the storm ran away. And once you have... so the story actually begins with this series of, meteorological department reports, newspaper reports, professors' lectures, etc. And the second part of the story is about the narrator of the story, who says that, well, actually, I'm going bald, and therefore I bought this oil to get my hair back on my head. And as I was traveling on a yacht on the sea, I realized that the storm was coming, and I poured the bottle of oil in the sea, and the storm disappeared, because according to the scientific principle of surface tension, the oil floats above the water. And because the storm could not get into the water, it was sucked away by the oil. The storm ran away. That's how it's explained at the end. It's an extremely humorous story in that sense. So this notion of irony, satire, that comes in by one of the leading scientists. So he's, of course, he's a well-known scientist of that time, is again something that becomes a part of the little genres. It was published in a story writing competition. In fact, interestingly, the story writing competition was sponsored by the hair oil company that Jagdish Chandra Bose was talking about. Anyway, so these are different kind of trajectories within that. And of course, you can have fantasies. I'll give you just two examples very quickly. 1892, you have Trilokunath Mukhopadhyay's Konkabati, which has again been translated by Nandini Bhattacharya. And in 1937, you have almost a similar translation of this thing. So both of them are actually translations, well, adaptations, not really translations, of Alice in Wonderland. And while it starts in an extremely social realist way, so it almost follows the conventions of the novel form. Konkaboti, just to give you an example, is about this village girl who is going to get married. She's extremely worried about her marriage because she doesn't know how to go and live in a city, etc., etc. So it's all about the concerns about city life, education, etc. And suddenly she gets into this extremely fantastic world when she goes near a lake and gets into this Alice world, in this wonderland. And in this fantasy land, of course, everything is topsy-turvy. There is a different kind of a nationalistic imagination. There is there are the extremists who want to throw away the British. There are the moderates who want the British to remain, but the Indians to be more independent, etc. So you have a different kind of a national imagination operating within these fantasies. The same thing happens with the 1937 text, which is in the strange land of Amala, by someone, a very famous speculative writer called Hemendra Kumar Rai. So you have different sorts of adaptations that are operating during this period, which are also fantasies. And there are other fantasies which I have not mentioned over here. Now, of course, you have interstellar travel, an important aspect of speculative fiction. So you have texts by people like Premendra Mitra on the left-hand side of the slide, where there's a lot of interstellar travel, and this especially starts happening around the 1920s and 30s. So it's not really the 19th century. But the one on the right was published in 1892 and was published by Jagadananda Roy, and it was called Travel to Venus, where two Bengali gentlemen produce that virile Bengali man. Now, remember, one of the things that the British did was, of course, emasculate the Indian. So, in the sense of the man was seen as feminized in a certain form through different kinds of images and different sorts of literature that was produced around it. So, you have the effeminate Bengali, which was produced. And Jagadanand Roy, in this text, Travel to Venus, is almost responding to that in a certain form. Now, again, very specific anti-colonial, very specific stereotypical or non-stereotypical representations that are being challenged through the speculative space. Remember, these are not novels, or these are not really mainstream writing. These are specific forms of writing that are produced in very small magazines and what I called the under the tree books, the Bottala books, etc. And of course, you have utopia and dystopia. Of course, all of you are aware of Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussein's Sultana's Dream, which is now become iconic in a certain sense, which can posit a feminist utopia in a certain sense, written originally in English. But of course, not many people know that Ruqayya also wrote quite a lot of other speculative pieces, which now have been translated about different sorts of possibilities of feminist utopia. And they have been translated in the last 3-4 years now. But Sultana's Dream, of course, was written in English, and it's about this woman who goes to the dreams of going to a place called Ladyland, where men have been put into what she calls Mardana. So for women, you have Zanana, but for men in this Ladyland, which is ruled by women, you have Mardana. So men are all kept in Mardanas. And women, of course, rule science, and they use science for productive purposes, for aesthetic purposes, etc. So who read this story? It's a very short story. But of course, you have dystopias in 1930s, which are, for example, again by Premendra Mitra, things like what he calls Pipre Puran, the Puranas of the ants, where the world is taken over by ants and the humans become slaves. And Mitra himself was influenced quite a lot by H.G. Wells. So many of his ideas come from H.G. Wells in these kind of dystopic imagination of not only people, but also a certain kind of a national literature. And then you have these very strange categories, which I don't know what to call, but you have nonsense, tall tales, hybrid. So the first picture that you see is again from Premendra Mitra, who wrote these, who was extremely famous for this character called Ghanada. Now, as you know, that in Bengali, Da is used for an elderly brother. So you have this Ghanada, who lives free of cost in a mess, who doesn't pay any money to anyone. And whenever people ask him for money, he says, I'll tell you a story. And he starts with these stories, and these are all extremely speculative stories, where he is the hero, of course, and travels across the world, etc. Now, these are extremely tall tales. No one believes him. But these tales themselves are very interesting because they kind of bring in a huge amount of cosmopolitanism, huge amount of understanding, trying to understand the world or the scientific enterprise, etc. You, of course, have hybrids like a picture that you find in the middle of the slide. And this is by a person called Hemendra Kumar Rai, who produces this very weird fiction category, horror, science fiction, etc. And you have nonsense like Shukumar Rai, the father of Satyajit Ray, um, where he writes a text called The Diary of Heshuram Hoshiar. Again, it has been translated into English now. Now, this is a very interesting text primarily because here it's written by someone called Professor Hesuram Hoshiar, who travels to a strange land and encounters all sorts of weird animals. And then when people ask him for proof, he says, I don't have any proof. And if you look at the years, Sukumar Rai's text, the one on the right, was produced in 1922. Hemendra Kumar Rai's text in the middle was produced in 1930s, I think 1936. And Ghanada, the one on the left, by Prema Mitra, was produced in 1945, right at the cusp of the independence. So you've got this entire trajectory of speculative fiction, not only in Bengal, but I'm sure across many other regional literatures, which challenges the entire notion of what generic boundaries, but also what are disciplinary boundaries. Now, how do we understand that disciplinary boundary? So probably the only thing that we can do is we try to trace the interdisciplinary trajectory that is available to us through different kinds of disciplines, like I showed, political geography, etc. And we can use them to understand. I'm not saying that completely discard the major genre of the novel, but we can explore the major genres in a certain way as a kind of a supplement to the major genre. So, or supplement, of course, not in a negative sense, but supplement in the sense of something that always already is there with the major genre. So in order to understand the major genre, you have to understand the so-called minor in that sense. So I'll stop over there, and I'm open to, I'll be more than happy to have a discussion, questions.
Yes, hello. The floor is open to questions. You may post the questions in the chat box or raise your hand so you can directly ask questions.
Thank you, Professor ATANU, for the wonderful presentation. And I understand that the speculative fiction and or the hybrids which you mentioned, they were all in a sense anti-colonial or alternative histories. Could you also tell us something about the general sense of science and technology which was prevalent in India at that time? In spite of the fact that they were all reactions against the colonial presentation, what was the general nature of science and technology in India at that time?
That's a very huge question, and I think we'll require another presentation, Dr. Johnson. But I'll try to be very brief in. Now, one of the things that happens with science and technology, of course, is there is a certain kind of colonial enterprise of bringing in science and technology, which comes in different forms. For example, there's the material presence of science and technology, like telegraphs and railways and other things that you can see, like architecture. Presence. So it's supposed to be based on rationalist principles of science. You cannot have, for example, legendary tales of science and what. So you really cannot go back to the legendary mode of storytelling now. So you can have science only within a rationalistic mode. So that's the second thing. The third thing, of course, is that science becomes probably the only mode of accessing truth. So if you are to be true, you to locate yourself within science and technology. And this also is produced through, for example, scientific exhibitions. So there are these massive exhibitions that are held in Calcutta and Madras and in Bombay, and later, of course, in London in 1880s, where of scientific machines, and, other forms of technological devices are available. Also, in a sense, a production of a superior civilizational value. For example, many of these exhibitions would have Adivasis as examples of a certain kind of cottage existence. So you have exotic, humble existence. The other side of the pavilion, even this in the new model of agriculturalism. So science was also used by the colonial rulers largely as a mode of establishing a certain kind of epistemological boundary in different ways. So, for example, through books, through actual material practices of science and technology, through inventions, etc. And if you go back to the newspapers of that time, it's got very interesting sections on different sorts of scientific inventions. For example, if you go back to the archive of the newspapers, you will see all the advertisements where you have to pay 1 anna to get into an exhibition. Well, not an exhibition actually, it's a house, and in this house will be exhibited a neon gas light, and people are willing to pay 1 anna to go and see that neon gas light, and that's it. So on the one hand, you have this wonder of science. On the other, you have this material change in the nature of the imagination of how you look at the world. So how do the Indians respond to that? I've given you some examples of how the Indians respond to that. So of course, one of the responses is that all this is not required. We have a golden past, so we can go back to it. But there are also very complex ways that Indians respond to it. I mentioned Jagdish Chandra Bose, who wrote that story called The Runaway Storm. Now, Bose himself had a very problematic negotiation with science. He believed, for example, that epistemological models or the Western model of science is something that is acceptable, that is the only way to understand the world. But he also was a very strong believer that there is a possibility of an alternative. And in his search for that possibility of the alternative, he gave many different kinds of theories. For example, he is, the one who found, well, posited and accepted now the telegraph or the telephone, for that matter. He also was the one who planned life. He was also one who believed that rocks have life. So there is life form in rocks. So you have an extremely complex situation where the Indians are responding to science in different kinds of ways, and extremely complex ways that they are responding to. Now, I'm not saying that the colonial regime is imposing a certain kind of a science, and it is very straightforward, because we know now that the way science is looked at in London, very different from the way they look at science in the colony. So there is also a complex negotiation going over there. But the thing that we need to understand is that when we look at, for example, fiction, or as students of literature, if we look at fiction, then probably it's important to understand the nature of complexity that is operating at the level of science, or at the level of implementation of science, of materiality of science. not only the ideology of science, a lot of people have talked about that, but not the actual material practice of science in the colonies. So that material practice. I hope I've been able to partially answer your question.
Sir. Yes, sir.
So there are a few things on the chat I can see. But there's one of the graphic novels, yes, definitely do contribute. For example, there is this one called I forgot the name of the novel. It's something Owlscaper. So you have graphic novels that kind of speculate in a certain way, but there are, if you look at Indian graphic novels, at least the beginnings of the Indian graphic novels, the early developments of graphic novels to modern times, if you see them, then kind of they're responding to contemporary history more, or past, or kind of very recent history. So you have, for example, responses to emergency. You have responses to, well, queer existences, sexual choices, etc. You have responses to 19th century, for example, in a certain way. You have also responses, for example, to mythological in Arundel, for example. And so it's an interesting question, whether will we put graphic novels into this thing? Well, some of them can be definitely speculative. The Barn Owl's Caper, I think it's called, is definitely speculative. In a certain sense, it goes back to the past to understand the present. But it's quite speculative in that sense. I don't know whether Amruta Patil's Kari definitely is not speculative, but I'm not very sure where to place her mythological ones, though the two that she recently produced. Totally speculative, again, something that we can think about. Yes. And I hope, Mary, I hope I've been able to answer.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Varsha's question is, why do you think education institutions skip most of these works while preparing the syllabi? I'm not very sure, Varsha. But probably one of the ways that we can think about it is that even when we, that's why I'm not suggesting that the major genre, for example, the novel or this thing should not be taught. We should teach speculative fiction. But one of the ways that we can understand these forms of what we call form is probably try to understand it through these. So instead of kind of putting them within the syllabi, it will be wonderful if we put them in the syllabi. Using them in the classroom itself will be helpful. So what are these minor forms doing in terms of supplementing, in terms of trying to understand the major form itself? So I think that will be helpful because syllabi making is not in my hand. I'm sure that it's not in your hand. So someone makes the syllabus for you. And there are other ways of negotiating that. How do you change that? As a teacher, I think what we can do is bring in these experiences of other forms within the classroom so that even if they are asked to teach a novel, for example, if I'm asked to teach Indulekha or Ananmat or whatever, what are these minor forms doing to the form of Ananmat? Or what is Ananmat doing to these other forms? So it's not simply what is the minor form doing to the major form, but what is the major form doing to the minor form? So those kinds of that kind of make sense? Prashna?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes, are there any more questions? So I have one, if you don't mind. Excuse me.
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So this historical fantasy, all these where we fantasize about certain parts of history that we do not know enough about. Does that count as speculative fiction as well, or does it have to be looking towards the future?
It's well, fantasy is part of a speculative fiction, where it goes back to the past or to the future doesn't really matter. Uh, I don't really answer this because many of the historical novels, so-called, written during the 19th century in India, they are not historical. They produce a fantastic history in a different way, including novels like Anand or novels like, again, Bankim Chandra's another novel called Devi Jodhuran. Primarily because they draw from, and I think Meenakshi Mukherjee has a wonderful paper on this. They draw largely from the British representation of the past, especially Todd's Annals of Rajasthan, etc. And therefore, what you see is a kind of attempt to create history where if you go to material history, it doesn't exist. But there is this attempt to create a certain kind of a different history and claiming it as the real history. Now, I think we have a discussion over there. Then we have to call them historical fiction rather than speculative fiction. The example that I gave you actually completely rewrites it. And it doesn't even claim that it's real history. It simply says, okay, let's imagine what a different history looks like. While the other historical fiction that you see in Bengal, and I'm sure in other parts of the country, is that there is an attempt to go back to that history to reclaim a certain kind of an identity, which can pose against the colonial regime or certain kind of an identitarian politics. Whether that is speculative, we don't really know. It is historical fiction, yes. It's like Scott going back to 18th century Scotland and recreating a certain kind of a heroic past of Scotland. Now, some license, but speculative would be much more, it's an imaginary history altogether. So you're not even claiming truth. You're simply saying, okay, fine, I'm imagining a different kind of history, and you don't have to believe it. That's the kind of the story.
Thank you, sir. So we have one more question in the chat box.
Oh, yes, I think I've answered Varsha. This is Varsha. So, do you think fantasy is method since spoken speculative fiction? Oh, yes, yes, absolutely. In fact, fantasy plays an important role primarily because it also allows, especially in the 19th century, writers to escape censorship. Very interesting history of censorship itself. For example, by 1780s already we have a censorship act, which is debated, and in 1830 we have a censorship act, and then there's the whole censorship in India. In 1833, the censorship act is revoked, so you can say whatever you want to say, even against the government, against the British, etc. but then it is imposed back after 1957. So one of the ways that writers negotiate this is by positing the speculative. So if I say I'm not talking about a world which is now, but I'm talking about a world which is possible in 1945, you will probably evade censorship. The same thing happened with a novel form. For example, Anand Math has a whole anti-colonial section, I mean, very anti-British in that sense. So it doesn't mention Britain. But he writes the preface in English. And because he writes the preface in English, what tends to happen is the censorship board, that's what is claimed, well, kind of anecdotally, we don't really know, there is no historical evidence for this. But anecdotally, people say that what censorship board used to do is they would read the preface. And if the preface contains something very seditious or very anti-government, then they would ban the book. So many of these writers, in fact, one of the key features of 19th century regional novels is that the preface was written in English, because they knew that the censorship board would read just the preface, which would praise the British and say that without the British, live, etc. So if you read Anandamat's preface, it's a very interesting preface, because Bankim actually says the British is absolutely necessary for this country. We can't do without it. But then what they do in the text is very different. So in a certain sense, yes. So censorship plays a role in creating the speculative. So it helps them to kind of avoid the direct oppression or jailing even sometimes by the British government. So they can escape by saying that not about now, we're talking about the future. Or we are not talking about now, we're talking about imagined space. So that's an interesting question. Thank you.